David Ouimet is an American artist, author and musician. He's led an eclectic life, starting in a rock music band before moving on to illustration, art and modelling, amongst other things. His debut children's book, I Go Quiet, has been a huge hit in UK schools for its sensitive portrayal of an introverted child trying to find her voice. The follow-up companion piece, I Get Loud, will be published in early July. David talked recently to Nikki from New York and told her more about his upbringing.
I grew up in a very creative family. My mother was a musician. My father was a painter. I was always encouraged to be creative. It was always part of my life. I ended up going to Rhode Island School of Design, originally thinking about going into art, and I ended up going through the film department, got a degree in filmmaking. I worked in the film industry. That was my first foray into living in New York. And I have always been drawing, and I've always been a huge reader. And I always had a dream of making a picture book. Attempted many, many times. And it just never felt right until this book. So I decided in the meantime that I would illustrate other works. And it was a great kind of view into the process. I worked with some incredible authors, Robert Souci and John Southworth, and it was a great joy. But it's a very, very different experience writing and illustrating a book, because it's truly mine. It's my responsibility. It's truly my voice. And it was the first book was quite honestly quite a difficult book to make on a lot of levels. It was a very, very emotionally draining book to make. I Go Quiet was based on a very personal experience I had, whereas I Get Loud was a very, very freeing book for me to create. It was a lot of joy that I put into it. There is a strong message of the characters in the book are being displaced, yet there is a very joyful message in it, and that kind of sprung forth while I was creating it.
Yeah, it's interesting. We will get into that in more depth, I hope, because there's lots of counterbalances between the two books. Lots to talk about there. I do want to ask you about your street art. I've been looking at your hoodie birds.
Hoodie birds, yes.
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 So what is a hoodie bird?
It came out of a doodle years ago, and I just started doodling on napkins these hoodie birds, so these strange looking birds in these hoodies. And I've always been a huge fan of street art, and being in New York, I was exposed to so much of it. I've been in New York since the 1980s, and that was a very, very different age of street art. So I've really seen the transformation of it becoming actually recognized as a true artistic expression. As opposed to when I first came to New York, it was really considered more of graffiti or noise, really. So I started doing the hoodie bird in New York, and then I've done it all over the world. And I really stopped doing it when I started I Go Quiet, because that book really required a lot of my full attention. But interestingly, I'm working on a book for very young children, and it is with the hoodie birds. So that's actually going to be coming back into the fray. I'll be bringing the hoodie birds back to life. Yes,
that's interesting. Maybe as we talk a little bit more about the books, we might see some connections across those things. For instance, I noticed in some of your street art, the patterning was very architecturally influenced and reminded me a lot of Renaissance Italy, which I get coming through maybe late Renaissance in your cityscapes and buildings.
Absolutely.
In your books as well. And birds. I mean, let's face it, the birds as well.
the birds are very, very important in both of the books. I mean, the birds, the crows particularly, I mean, they represent new beginnings, rebirths. And I think that was, using them as symbols was something that was very effective. And I will continue to use birds. I just think I love to draw birds, and I just love the weight of them symbolically. both books were very, very influenced by architecture. And I Go Quiet was particularly influenced by Piranesi, who's the Italian architect. And he had done a whole series of imaginary prisons. I mean, they were just the most spectacular images, architectural images. They're very, very imposing, and they really create a sense of fear in a way. And I felt that using architecture in that way of conveying fear would be a great way of representing the fear that the girl in the book was going through with her own isolation and her own anxieties. So yes, architecture was very, very important.
We talked very briefly about I Go Quiet, because you have talked about this book quite a lot, and there are interviews that people can listen to. But for anybody who isn't familiar with I Go Quiet, it's essentially about a young girl who's experiencing feelings of isolation and anxiety, and it's about her coming to find her voice. It has a trajectory that starts fairly dark, gets increasingly dark, and very gradually actually emerges into some kind of lightness.
I wouldn't call it lightness. I would call it a hope. I really wanted to convey that we don't go through dark things, whether it's, feeling like we are not heard or feeling small. I don't think we ever merge out of those things and fully just come into the light and everything is fine. We always experience these things. They're like, let's go back to birds. They're like birds. We'll always see a sparrow and it will fly away, but it will always come back. And I feel that that's the same thing with, certain forms of anxiety and isolation. So, I think the important thing for me that was the end is hopeful, but it's about taking little steps to get to a better place. It's not about rainbows and unicorns. It's really about looking at it from a very, very sensible place where we can move emotionally from darkness.
It's a very personal story. It feels like an individual story, and yet set against that is a feeling that somehow society creates this problem. I'm coming at it from the images inside school, the way that we require young people to be sometimes, where they have no control over what that is like. And it reminded me in that sense of, I don't know if Pink Floyd are a band over in the United States.
Of course they are. Yes.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
But the vision of school, the sausage factory,
right.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's interesting because the book is published in Brazil and in Portuguese, and there's been a lot of references. I guess Pink Floyd is very big in Brazil, but there've been a lot of references to that. It's funny because as a teenager, that album meant a lot to me. It did influence. I mean, I think music in general is a huge, huge influence on my work, and also on the construction of the books. I mean, I use a lot of musical ideas and concepts to construct my books. I am a musician as well, and those, that skill set really, I find is invaluable for looking at constructing a picture book.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, but I think before we do that, I'd like to introduce our listeners to I Get Loud so they know what the book is actually about. You tell us in your words.
Well, I Go Quiet really ended up on, like I said, on a hopeful note, but there was a sense of, well, what is the next step? And I felt that it was really important to continue the story in a way that brought the idea of friendship and the power of friendship, and also the reality that we can fall out of those friendships. And in this situation, it was through a situation of displacement. And the young girl and her friend are inseparable. They have this beautiful, strange relationship, and they are separated. And I think that the UN just published a report. Despite the pandemic we're in, displacement has increased. People are being forced out of their home due to conflict and violence. There are 82.4 million people displaced worldwide, and 42% of them are children. and it's only increasing. And it's been increasing, for the last 10 years. So I think originally the book was probably more about that, and I backed off a little bit. I didn't feel like that should be the subject, but I did want that to be something that was prevalent in the book, and it's done in the background. You notice thousands of people moving and having to moving out of their homes and the relocation. So against that background is this really beautiful story of this friendship between these two girls, and eventually they are reunited. And it really is the kind of message of hope that I just hinted at the end of I Go Quiet.
It's interesting because I felt that when I read I Get Loud, that it was more of a universal rather than individual story. So it was, they both are to some extent, but whereas one felt very personal, inward looking, the other felt much more expansive and looking out to the world, I would have said.
That's so interesting, because one of the things that I thought of while making I Get Loud was how the conflict in the first book, and I Go Quiet, was an internal conflict. She was struggling with her internal feelings. The conflict that arises in I Go Quiet is an external conflict. It's the conflict of having to flee her home. So, they're both dealing with, at the core, the same thing, which is, the weight of a conflict and how we can move through it and remain whole and remain together. And yet they're coming from different places. So there's kind of a flip-flop of where that source is.
And because you do it in these kind of strange landscapes, it becomes very timeless. It's not about a specific conflict.
I'm glad it resonates like that, because I also feel that coming out of a pandemic, that we've all felt a sense of displacement of, whether it's personal or, certainly there's been politically around the globe, there's been a sense of displacement. And I think, it could be read in a number of different ways and a number of different interpretations.
As all the best things can. I wanted to ask you about the music a little bit, because the images are fantastic, but I almost said lyrics, actually. One of the things that I would love to do with children with this book is, and this is not out of disrespect to the imagery, but I almost want them to experience the words without image and to see what mental imagery comes to them, because the words are extraordinary. And I wonder whether you wrote those separately or whether they came together with the image, because they stand alone as well.
They do. That's, one of the most beautiful things about picture books. There is something innately musical about a picture book. The fact that you can read it in, less than 10 minutes, essentially, just like, a good song. And you can read it over and over or listen to it over and over, and it can reach a very, very deep emotional point, both picture books and music. So I see a lot of connections between that. I, previously illustrated other people's works, and so the words were always there. And as an artist, as being, fundamentally an artist first, I always assume when I would be making my own picture books that it would arise from, doodles or images. But it's not the case. I've actually written both I Go Quiet and I Get Loud. I wrote the words first. And I really did think of them very much as lyrics. It's interesting. A lot of people have said, this is really a book. It's an illustrated book of poetry, with both of them. And it is very poetic, but I think for me, it's more just coming from a musical place.
You said about drawing on musical ideas and musical structures. Tell me a little bit more about that.
There are so many elements to writing a piece of music, which is, rhythm, dynamics, dissonance, and all of those can be applied to creating a picture book. There is a very, very strong sense of rhythm in each of the books. And that was fundamental for both of the books. It's very much part of the kind of flow, the way they flow. There's also the dissonance that's created with the architecture or the, the water in the second book. I mean, they're all, I thought of them all in terms of musical concepts of how to construct a piece of music. And then certainly the idea of having the lyrics, which I do write lyrics before the music, and then putting the music to the words, same thing, except it was just imagery. In a lot of ways, whether it's sitting down at a piano or sitting down with a paintbrush, I feel that they're the same things. They're just different ingredients.
I wanted to talk a little bit about how the images are rendered. I know you work on a tablet because I've done my homework and I've seen the pictures of you doing that. But your street art must be made with physical materials.
It is, yes.
So what is it that rendering something, on a tablet, what does that enable you to do that perhaps the physical materials don't?
Well, I begin all of my artwork on paper. And I start with black and white. And once I have the sketch finished, I'll scan the image, and then it's scanned into my iPad, and I work on the iPad. And the beautiful thing about that is that I can work anywhere. So just having that portability and always having my iPad with me, it never leaves my side. I'm always working on artwork, and it's a process that I really, really enjoy. But once it goes into the iPad, I output it onto watercolor paper. It's basically printed on watercolor paper, and then I go on top of that and I add colored pencils. I put graphite on it, so it starts off physical, it goes to the digital realm, and then it ends up back on an actual piece of paper.
That's interesting. You don't color on the iPad; you color with pencil.
I lay down very, very much kind of blocked colors on the iPad. And then I do a lot more of the detailed and the shadowing and the highlights, and just kind of bringing out the colors with the color pencils or with the paint.
Absolutely fascinating, because in a sense, I guess you can do anything. You can get texture on an iPad.
I can take a picture of a leaf on the ground, and then I can literally make that leaf, the texture of that leaf, the shape of the brush, and then I can paint with that. And it's very similar to the idea in music of having a musical sample, of sampling a cat meowing, and then you can play the cat meowing on each of the keys and create chords. It's very much a very, very similar idea.
Technology, it's wonderful, isn't it? So I want to come back to some of the visual imagery in the book. So I'm going to come back to birds.
Mm-hmm.
So we had our corvids of ravens and crows in the first book. And here we've got the Indian brown dove. I'm probably reaching too far here, but ravens and doves and floods remind us of a story of Noah.
Yes.
Am I reaching too far?
No, there are certain references there. I didn't know if, again, you just don't know if readers will pick up on these references, but I read so much about floods when I was doing the book. And I just, I do a lot of research, and a lot of it is just reading to try to get a sense of language and how the language will be best utilized to convey these things. So, a lot of the references, they just kind of creep up in the book. It's like they just pop up, and I'm like, oh, that's where this comes from. It's all very organic.
I always think of those things as being the texture of a book that doesn't need explanation, but somebody's going to pick it up somewhere.
Right,
and
right.
Give them a resonance, a different kind of resonance.
I love layered work, whether it's literature or poetry. I love the idea of layers, and that's that those influences and those references to me are just part of these many layers in the book. It's so interesting how it can reach emotional points in people, and it may be subconscious, but there's always discoveries to be made when you're thinking about building things in layers and layers and layers.
And of course, they're there at the end on the wires, and the girls are looking up at their birds. One of the other things that struck me as a sort of counterpoint to I Go Quiet is the presence of so much blue sky in this book. And whereas I felt I Go Quiet, there's a very striking image actually where she literally goes down into herself, almost in that embryonic pose. And I felt that was very much a book where there's a lot of looking down. And in this book, there's a lot of looking up to the sky, and you've got the kites flying up in the sky.
And that was really conveying an openness. It was about opening her heart up to other people and to having a friendship. It's interesting you brought that particular image up, because that image of the girl. She's just anguished. It's just it's a very, very painful image in a lot of ways. She literally feels like she is in a smog. And originally my image was just a smog. And my editors said to me, this is the darkest the book is going to get. You need to bring it darker. And I was just so surprised, because I already felt the book is so dark. I don't want to go darker, but it was so effective because she's going to emerge out of it. She is going to, find books and be enriched, but this needs to be an emotional point in the book. And so it was a very, very surprising editorial direction, but I think it's so powerful. So I think it was brilliant.
Another thing that really struck me was the use of threads that connect us. There are a lot of lines in the book,
yes.
Whether it's the flying of the kite or the fishing line or the lines that are kind of connecting across the city. And that final image of the two girls, and they have the line between them, really kind of takes you back, just as in I Go Quiet, the first and the final images speak to each other. It's exactly the same here. We've got two images that are speaking to each other. There's no kite at the end of the line now. There's another human being.
Another person. And that's, and they literally, their friendship is really represented by those lines. And when they are in the storm, in the sea, they're held together by this rope, on their journey to a new land on their boats. And the storm gets so violent that one of the girls, she can't hold on to the rope any longer. And they let go of each other, and they eventually float away from each other. And then eventually come back. But that sense of lines and ropes and kite strings and all of that was an important way for me to represent the connection between the two of them.
And as you say, the wind that breaks can also be the wind that binds. So through the storm we can perhaps come together stronger than ever. And I want to thank you so much for writing two books that are so profound and can be read on so many different levels by just about anybody from 3 to 103. Everybody can get something from these glorious works of art. So, David, thank you so much for joining me in the Reading Corner today.
Thank you so much. It's been such a great pleasure.
In the Reading Corner is presented by Nikki Gamble and produced by Alison Hughes. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please do leave a review for us. To find out about other projects, including an audience with events and the Exploring Children's Literature Summer School, visit www.exploringchildrensliterature.uk. Join us again soon in the Reading Corner on your favourite podcast platform.